Hello, everyone. Good evening and good afternoon to whatever part of the world you are from. This is Fatma Tariq today, and with me I have Mr. Sarim Raza. He is today we'll be talking about climate change and the inequality that it is bringing about. But before we begin, I would like to thank everyone who's here, who's watching. We would love your input. This talk is for you guys. And with us, we have Mr. Sarim Raza, who will be answering some great questions on climate change and inequality. About Sarim, Sarim is a junior category manager at thewhy.com. That is Pakistan's biggest healthcare online platform. He's also the founder of Mawesh E-Mandi as well as Retex. Sarim is also a youth wing leader of UNCTAD. With that said, there's a lot more that Sarim is doing. I would like to hand over the floor to Sarim to introduce and tell us a little more about what he does.
Thank you so much, Fatma. Just a small introduction. I'm currently working with the Y.PK, Pakistan's biggest health tech platform. We're working on making healthcare affordable and accessible for everyone. Apart from that, I'm currently working on two startups. One is Retex, the other is Mawesh E-Mandi. Through Mawesh E-Mandi, we're trying to digitize the market for livestock here in Pakistan. Apart from with Retex, what we're trying to do is that we're trying to connect the sustainable producing SMEs in Pakistan, textile producing SMEs with the international market. And that's something that we're doing through Retex. Apart from that, I'm the founder and coordinator for the UNCTAD Youth Action Hub here in Pakistan. What we're trying to do is we're trying to build a youth-led policy think tank here in Pakistan. We're working on a couple of projects, namely two projects right now. That one is a gender-based violence task force, where we are working on policy recommendations that decrease gender-based violence in Pakistan. Apart from that, the other project that we're working for is Act for Food, Act for Change, where we are spreading awareness regarding the importance of food systems and nutrition. So that's a short, brief intro from my side. So over to you, Fatma. So
Oh, here we are together. All right. So, Sarim, thank you so much for this introduction. It seems like you are working a lot. You write into all those different streams of life and work that's happening. So I guess I'm definitely sure that you've got, you can understand the different perspectives of, inequity and climate change. We are working with livestock, you're working with healthcare. So these are aspects that are definitely getting affected. How about if you could kind of introduce a little more about this topic and what's happening and what do you think?
So for me, for inequity is something that's very close to my heart. That's something that I've been noticing from a very young age. And when I started studying climate change in general, one of the things that came for me is that, okay, climate change is going to make our world inhabitable, but how is it going to affect the rich and the poor differently? And that is when I started noticing the things that I've been seeing all around us. So, for example, here in Pakistan, the poorest section of the society, you will always see them living in places that are more polluted, that have less hygienic situations around them. And living in these situations, they are more prone to diseases, they are more prone to other things, which result in their decreased productivity and reinforce the cycle of poverty. And when that was a micro level that I was observing here in my country, that the poorest section of the society is living in places that are the most polluted. That was the micro level understanding for me, that here in my country, this is what's happening. And then I zoomed out and I saw, okay, I saw that on a larger world, globally, what's happening is that uh, developed countries are the most responsible for climate change, yet the most vulnerable sections of the society that are the most prone to the dangers of climate change are living in developing countries. And that struck me. That struck me that people who are actually profiting from climate change are living in developed countries, yet the effects of climate change are being mostly targeted towards vulnerable sections of the society that are living in developing countries. So that was my understanding at a macro level. And then one of the things that I started realizing was that, okay, this is happening at a micro and a macro level, but climate change essentially in the market, in the system, we're talking about not just climate change, we're talking about how we can change the system. One of the things that struck me was that climate change has inequitable effects on different sections of society based on socioeconomic classes. But adding on to that, our system is designed in a way that allows people to commodify any problem that they see. And climate change in the 20th century is the biggest problem. And one of the things that I started noticing was that climate change essentially has become a commodity, which allows people who come from affluent backgrounds to buy products that mitigate some of the risks of climate change. So, for example, uh, if the if the air around you gets polluted, then you have the option of buying this oxygen bottle that gives you fresh oxygen, and so on and so forth. And if we one of the things that I started noticing was that if this trend continues, that we'll be living in a very dystopian future, where the people who have resources have the option to mitigate risk of climate change, yet the poorest section of the society will be living in a world where they don't have anywhere to go. So that was why I started working on this. And when I started researching more, I saw a lot of trends that how climate change is exacerbating present inequities also. So that's a short overview of the project, of the topic. Fatma?
Right. Thank you, Sarim, so much for this quite insightful understanding of climate change. And it's quite, um, it's it, it's not so surprising, but at the same time, it's just very harsh to kind of realize that climate change is exacerbating. It's not the climate change that's the problem itself, but it's also creating a lot of inequity amongst us as communities, right? And I just wanted to kind of, and this new thing is emerging that even though climate change is a disaster, it's terrible, and yet it's being commodified, which is surprising. But at the same time, like you said, problems get commodified. So I'd really like if you could talk a little bit more about how climate change is being commodified. How are people making benefit of something that is so disastrous?
So one of the things that's being done right now is that there is a trend from the millennials that we want products that have a green element attached to them, and a lot of companies that have made a lot of money from contributing to climate change are now greenwashing their brands, and that's a clear example of how climate change essentially is being a commodity and translated into products that we have been using for the last 100 years. Apart from that, there are certain products that are specifically for climate change. So, for example, I mentioned if the air gets polluted, I have the option of buying a disposable oxygen can that allows me to breathe fresh oxygen. So, fresh oxygen essentially that was not an issue 100 years ago. So, for example, in Beijing, the air is most polluted, and in Lahore, also in Pakistan, during the winters, there's a lot of smog, and a lot of people can't go outside. So they get these disposable oxygen cans that allow them to breathe fresh oxygen when they go outside. Apart from that, one of the other commodities that has recently touched the market is air purifiers. So what air purifiers do is that you keep them inside your house and they purify the air that's at least inside your house. So you have a clean air inside your house. So essentially, when you look at it, is that you go 100 years behind and you won't find these products, and you will not find a market for these products. But climate change essentially has created a market for these products, which has resulted in climate change being commodified and people making products that are being sold just for the benefit of them. So and that's a very dystopian thing to see, because most of the people, so for example, clean oxygen, I would say, is a human right, and that human right was being given 100 years ago. But now, because of climate change, that human right is being violated. And what our present system is allowing people to do is that it's allowing them to commodify that problem and making that human right extensively for the richer section of the societies, because air purifiers, oxygens, I don't think so a person living on 20,000 rupees per month and living below the poverty line is able to afford these kinds of luxuries. And this kind of person is essentially the person who wants these products the most, because a person who works on daily wages, he is going to go outside to work. He might be working in the construction industry where he has to go outside, and he needs these kinds of products. He needs to be healthy. His physical well-being is very important for the kind of productivity and the work that he does and the kind of money he earns. So I see climate change being commodified, and it's in turn also exacerbating present inequities. So
Yeah. So thank you, Sarin, for this quite for this, for letting us know. And I feel like while you're telling this, I feel like that's also reducing the emergency from climate change. It's reducing the emergency to do something about it, right? Instead of taking sustainable efforts, or instead of making, instead of doing something that could help all of us, they're just trying to treat the symptoms rather than go for the cure, the actual cure, right? So with that, there is another question that Henry has asked, and I'm going to show it on screen as well. So Henry has asked that at COP26, the Global North refused to agree to a damage compensation fund for the Global South. What do you think the Global South can do to change this position?
I think one of the things that we need to do is we need to be
Mhm,
united in the kind of things that we want to ask the global north,
mhm,
because one of the things that's very present in the global south is multinational companies. Multinational companies are the biggest contributors to climate change, yet most
mhm,
of them operate in the developing economies also, and they see the developing economies as an emerging market. So, for example, Unilever, P&G, all of them operate here in these countries.
mhm.
So, the question that we need to ask ourselves is that we need to have a united front, and this is something that we should be asking as a basic right, because we are the countries that are going to be the most affected by climate change, yet we have contributed the least towards it. So this is going to be something that we need to fight for as a united front. And the global north, we need to work on an agenda that allows us to negotiate better with the global north. And rather than having the global north and the global south, the climate change issue is not about the north and the south, it's about the entire world. So we need to sit with everyone and see this is everyone's problem. And in order to solve that, the people that are going to be the most affected, they need more resources. And that is the kind of argument that we need to push for. But again, one of the things that we need to do is we need to have a united front. We can't have just multinational contributing to most of the GDP of developing economies, because if we have multinational companies contributing the most to the GDP of developing economies, then they will always have a more say in the kind of financial agreement that we come up with. So I think we need to have a united front and we need to negotiate better, and that is something that we need to push to more towards.
Right. Definitely, I think this is definitely take should be taken as a problem for everybody. But it just seems that, and it's coming out as we see that. Why is it that countries or underdeveloped places that are the least contributors of climate change, why are they the ones facing more consequences? If you could elaborate on that.
So I think uh, the one element behind it is the geography behind it. Most of the developing countries are geographically placed in a situation where they're at most more risk to climate change. So, for example, coastal nations or island nations, they're the most at risk to climate change. And historically, they have not been able to develop economically. So, they don't have the resources to tackle climate change. And most of their and because of their geographical location, they're at most risk to climate change. And apart, so the first part of the question is that the first reason as to why developing economies are at most risk is because of the geography behind it. Some countries are geographically placed in a situation which makes them more at risk to climate change. And the second is historically, developing economies have not been able to uh, divert the kind of resources that are needed for human development. So they're the most at risk of of climate change, because can you give me a second?
Sure.
So they're the most at risk to climate change because they have not been able to invest in human development, and climate change is going to affect human development the most. So, for example, one of the things that's going to be affected the most are the present food systems that we have. And the food systems in developed countries are much better developed as compared to developing economies. And climate change is going to affect food systems the most. Developed countries have a better chance of revamping their food systems to adjust to climate change as compared to developing economies who don't have the kind of resources that allow them to revamp their food systems to adjust for climate change that is taking place throughout the world. So that's one of the reasons. And an additional layer on top of that is that developed countries are the major contributors to climate change, and they're making the most money out of it also. So they have more resources at their disposal to actually work on mitigating the risks of climate change as compared to developing economies. So developing economies, so if you discuss something like climate change in Pakistan, so it's also considered a luxury at some point in time, because for people here, if you're living below the poverty line, you don't know where your next meal is coming from. And then just thinking about climate change, that's a luxury for them. But so that's the kind of scenario that we're operating in. Whereas in the developed countries, most people have the luxury to think about climate change as a problem. So that's going to be, that's one of the reasons also that developed countries are better equipped to deal with climate change as compared to developing countries.
Right. Thank you, Sarim, for this. I just also kind of occurs to me that if you look at it historically, a lot of the underdeveloped countries have a relationship with the developed countries, in terms of colonial legacy. The countries that are developed today used to be the colonizers in the underdeveloped countries, in which, they've quite drained a lot of the resources, they've developed themselves, and they're taking it forward, and there's a neo-colonialism still going on, whereas the underdeveloped countries are still, they're not colonized, but they are kind of still facing the consequences of what's happened. They are, they're lacking resources, and now they have climate change upon their heels, so the situation is definitely being exacerbated. With that, we do have a question from Henry. I'd like to show them. They are two. I think they're quite similar, but you can take a jab at it. One, do you think that the rich believe they can mitigate all or even most of the impacts of climate change? Do you think this is possible? Or the other question is quite similar. Do you think that the rich believe they can buy their way out of climate change? Yes, I think that's quite a question. What Henry's trying to ask is that even if the global north, has a lot of resources, they're commodifying climate change, do you really think that, having the resources and having just one part of the world commodifying it, being able to tackle it better, do you think that they will be able to work on it? Because even if the world is connected, especially now, so what happens to other parts of the world will probably affect, right? But we'd like to hear you on this, Sarin.
So I can't speak about what the rich think in general, and I won't comment on that specifically, but I would like to comment on where we are going as a system. So, for example, the two richest people in the world, Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, are currently experimenting with outer space technology, and they also piloted their first outer space flights within the last 2 months. Those flights were essentially done by the two richest people in the world, yet their carbon emissions were off the charts. So the problem here is that the rich, again, doing things that allow them, that is contributing to everyone's problem, yet they have the solution, and they're using their resources to come up with solutions that allow them to mitigate some of the risk. So for example, so I won't speak about whether the rich as a populist think that we can get out of climate change, but I will comment on the present system that we have right now. The present system is that you look at the market, you look at the problems that are in the market, and you solve them, and you commodify them, and you sell the products. And that is how we're being going. And if we work along those lines, we'll just look at climate change as one big problem. We'll try to solve that, and we'll commodify that so that the rich can, so people, not even the rich, I would say people who have resources are going to be able to afford those solutions, whereas the poor will not be able to. So if I go back to the Elon Musk and the Jeff Bezos discussion, so in this dystopian future, if we have enough resources right now in the trajectory that we are going right now, if Earth becomes inhabitable in some point in the future, they're just gonna say, okay, we have had it. We have the resources, we have the spacecraft, we're just gonna live upstairs. That's something that's very dystopian, but it's very true. It can happen with the kind of trajectory that we're going towards. And if we have something like this, if so, for example, living in outer space becomes a commodity, Earth becomes inhabitable, only the rich have the ability to go to outer space and live a normal life that was perfectly possible on Earth 100 years ago. So I have a problem with. So I won't comment on the rich. I don't think so. The rich. I don't have an agenda against the rich. I have an agenda. I have a problem with the current system that's in place that tells you that in order to solve anything, you need to commodify it and sell it. And I have a huge problem with that. And I see that system uh, uh, exacerbating present inequities and taking away basic human rights that were with every person 100 years ago. It was everyone's basic right, but now it's the only the rich can afford it. So for example, bottled water was not a commodity 100 years ago, but now it's a commodity. And that if you went in time 100 years back in time and you told a person that I'm going to sell bottled water for 40 rupees or 50 rupees, he's just going to laugh at you, right? But at in a present day and age, that has become a commodity. Water used to be a basic right 100 years ago, but now it has become a commodity. So I have a problem with the present system, and we need to reevaluate the kind of systems and incentives that we have, and we need to see which direction that system is leading into. So for example, in the startup space also, there's a lot of disruption taking place, but that disruption is fueled by commodification. So we need to reevaluate what we call valuable and how we allocate our resources.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarim. I'm definitely sure that this is something that we need to do. I feel like, it's just high time that we all as humans kind of start empathizing with each other's problem instead of acting so selfishly and just for ourselves. We have a comment from Said. I'm going to share it on screen. Just like ILO proposed social protection floor, states must have climate protection for communities that are highly vulnerable. Again, it's a challenge for countries that are high in debt. Um, Sarim, if you'd like to say anything in response to that.
I completely agree, and I think that this should be done. But the problem again is that the people who are being affected by climate change the most, it's a huge population, and developing again, adding a seconding your point, say, developing countries don't have the resources to do that. So, for example, if you live in a low income uh, area, there is less space per house, and there's a lot less green area in low income communities as compared to developed communities. And in very hot days, these low income communities have a 5 degree Celsius temperature difference that makes it much hotter for them as compared for communities which have greenery, which come from the high income level of the society. So just because income levels have different effects, have uh, uh, make climate change have different effects on communities. So I do agree that we need to do this, but again, the big question in the room is who pays for it, and that's something that we need to decide. Who? So we need know the problem, we know the effects, but the problem again, the big elephant in the room is who pays for it. And I believe the people who have contributed and benefited the most from it should pay for it. So the ceilings that we're talking about, I think the people and the companies that have profited the most, not just on the tax on the money that they're going to make in the future. I think there needs to be a historical analysis of the kind of money they have made, and there should be retribution on that.
Great, awesome. I hope that answers what Said has been commenting about. Thank you, Sarim. So, Sarim, we're moving towards the close of our talk. It's been great. It's been really insightful. If you'd like to share any resources with the audience, if they'd like to read up more about this to gain more understanding and insight, we can put that in the chat box. If you can share them with us or mention them in the talk as well.
Um, Give me a second. I will just put on some resources that I've shared.
Okay,
Uh,
if you've shared them with me, I can also share them further as well. In the
okay.
chat box on our talk. Other than that, Sarim, we are closing. Would you like to have any closing comments or something that you'd like to leave us to think about, or like ending message?
So my ending message would be for the general young people that have joined this talk is that always don't accept things as they're being branded or being given to you. Always rethink and take your try to understand the big picture behind things, and that's something that we need uh, as as a generation. We need to see, we need to have a balcony view of the world that we're living in, and we need to understand the problems, and we need to find solutions, and we need to rethink some of the approaches. And for me, the biggest thing that we need to see is how we generate value and how we attach value to things. Because for the last 100 years, what we have been doing is that if you can commodify a certain thing, you can generate value in the community. And that's something that we need to rethink. Uh, what it is to generate value in the 20th century, and how we can reward people who are generating the kind of value that is benefiting not just themselves, but the entire planet in general. So these are some of the things that I would like all of you to think about, how we can uh, rethink the system that we're living in.
Thank you so much, Sarim. That has been great message. Definitely, as young people ourselves, it's something that we have to start questioning, start challenging, and start thinking outside of the box. So thank you once again, Sarin. Thank you everyone else who has been in the talk with us for some amazing questions and some amazing insights that we are having. It's definitely it seems like it's not just climate change that is our challenge today, it's inequity as well. So that's kind of added to the burden, but at the same time, maybe if we kind of work on making things more equal, it might actually even mitigate climate change itself, right? So Isaim, if you want to kind of add to that, that would be great. Otherwise, we are great, good to go.
So I think there are two major problems that we're facing right now. First is climate change. Second is inequity. The kind of inequity we have right now,
Mhm.
never in the history of the world we have seen such inequity in the world. So we need to rethink our approach on that.
Great. Agreed once again. I guess it's time that we, as human beings, kind of rethink or reframe ourselves on this planet. It's not about countries, it's not about developing north or south. It's about human beings living on one earth. Even if the rich think that they can get away, that's still a probability. It's not, yet true. It hasn't happened yet. So they might actually end up failing in it. So why not place your bets in something that is there? We still have this earth, there are still chances to mitigate climate change or even adapt to it. Maybe spend the money that they're spending on going out, they could maybe spend it making this world a better place, and they wouldn't even have to escape. So that is something that and I think this is the message that we as young people have to kind of spread amongst ourselves, and to those that are on the higher tier, that maybe let's connect rather than disconnecting. So with that said, thank you so much, Sarim, again to all our audience. It was a lovely talk. Have a great day, everybody.